So I am going to share my screen and we are going to go ahead and, like I said, get started here. So welcome everyone. We're excited to be hosting really a testing information night specifically focused on the ACT. And of course, I'm sure you all have many pressing questions about what just happened, the digital PSAT, and more importantly, the digital SAT testing that will begin later this spring. My name is Patrick Hennis. I am Senior Director here. I also oversee a lot of the work in the Northern Peninsula. I'm joined by my colleague, Andrew Shore. Andrew is our Director of Test Prep, and he's going to be in beginning this conversation today, focusing mainly on the new digital SAT and PSAT. So, Andrew, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Well, welcome. I'm really excited to be sharing some of this information with everyone here this evening. A little bit of background, if anybody wasn't already aware. This was about a little more than a year ago, the College Board announced that they were taking the old SAT and turning it into a computerized form. And that has just recently really started to properly kick into full gear. So the first proper administration of the digital SAT isn't until next March. So until then, there are 2 more administrations of the old paper and pencil test this November and December. But already the PSAT this past week for most students, and perhaps later this month for a few, was administered digitally, which was a new thing. And I think a lot of students were surprised by it. I think a lot of parents were surprised by it. And yeah, one of the things that we want to cover today is what the different changes are to the test with this new format, and what that means for students' plans and preparations and that. In general, the concept of students taking the SAT at regular dates scheduled throughout the year has not changed, but there likely will be additional options for students to take it at their school at various points during the year. One last note on this, as far as the timeline is, the digital test actually has already had a little bit of exposure, and we've had some exposure to it working with some international students. So over the past calendar year, the international version of the SAT has been computerized, which has hopefully allowed them to work out some kinks before they release it broadly here. So a little bit about sort of the process of this new test and how it compares to the old variant. First of all, a lot of it is very the same. So for example, the registration process is identical to the old one. There are regular calendar dates that are strewn throughout the year that you can sign up for to take the test. In fact, the registration for the first 3 spring dates next year just opened earlier today. So students will still register online to take the test at a particular location at a particular date. They will still be administered at testing centers, so mostly these are local high schools. They are computerized. This means that students can, when they go to the testing center, everything's all the same up until the point where they actually sit down, and rather than filling out a bubble sheet on a piece of paper, they're using a computer. Students are allowed to bring their own device, pretty open-ended as far as any laptops that they want, in addition iPads, though not other tablet devices. They do also have an option if a student does not have a device that they can use or would rather not use their own device, to request one to borrow from the College Board. This process has to be done at the time of registration, and this is one of those that I think may be a little difficult if you don't get it early. So that's an important one if you're looking at that. The actual proctoring process is now on the computer as well. I think this is hopefully a benefit for a lot of students, because historically one of the greatest risks on test day was that there was some proctoring mistake. The proctor timed things wrong. There was some issue during the test. That's all automated on the computer right now, which should make things a little more consistent as far as student experience there. The other big change as far as the process of taking the test is the scores. So previously on the old test, it took around 2-ish weeks before students received the scores, the results of their test. College Board hasn't explicitly said how long this is going to take now, but in their language, it's days rather than weeks. So hopefully a little more immediate in terms of when students get to find out how they actually performed on the test. Getting a little more into the details of the actual test itself here. So the test format has changed a fair bit. The old test had 3 different sections. There was the reading section, the writing and language section, and actually technically 2 math sections. It's been simplified and split up a little bit differently now. So there is no longer a separation between the reading and the writing and language. You have a reading and writing section followed by a math section. Each of those is split up into 2 different modules. Students take these back to back. Each one is individually timed. They're a little over a half hour each. And then there's a 10-minute break that students get in between these sections. Like I said, all the timing is done on the computer and automated, so this should be pretty exact. They just do one section, it immediately jumps them to the next. When they have the break, they can get up and walk around for a bit there. One thing that is a bit interesting that the SAT is introducing with the computerized testing is what's called adaptive testing. This is something that's existed in a number of different standardized tests that were computerized previously. And what this means is based on the student's performance, they will get one of 2 different versions of the test. So the way this works is in each section, both the reading and the writing and the math section, the student's performance on the first module is graded immediately, and then depending on how many questions they got correct or incorrect, they either get a harder or an easier version of the second module. This thing gets contributed into their score in a way that's a little convoluted, but effectively it still means that the more questions they get correct, the better it's going to be for them. The goal of adaptive testing is hopefully to give questions that are just more appropriate on a student-by-student basis. So students who are struggling at one section or another don't have to spend time on questions that are way above their difficulty level, and vice versa. If a student's breezing through questions, they don't have to go through 10 more easy questions before they get to some of the more challenging ones. The test is still majority multiple choice. The reading and writing section is entirely multiple choice. The math section is primarily multiple choice with a few questions that are free response where they simply enter a number. There's no written response or free response beyond any of that. Last, we have the scoring, which is relatively unchanged. The only real major difference here is, like I mentioned, the reading section and the writing and language section, which used to be separate, are now joined, which means so are their scores. So students will receive a single score for reading and writing out of 800, a single score for math also out of 800, and then a composite score, just the sum of those 2 out of 1600. A bit more on the actual computerized nature of the new test. So the test is administered in an application that the College Board wrote called Blue Book. This is the same applications that some students already have or potentially will in the future be using for AP tests. It's hopefully good. It means that preparing for one, they've already seen the interface, they understand how it works for any of the other tests. It does require an internet connection. However, this does not mean that students will lose their work if they're disconnected, if the Wi-Fi drops out or anything like that. The way this works is as soon as they start the test, the entire test contents are downloaded to their computer and stored locally. They work through the test on their computer, and then at some point, I don't remember the exact workings, but I believe within the day, they have to reconnect to the internet to make sure that their scores are actually sent to be processed by the College Board. What this means for students is that they just don't have to worry if their school has spotty Wi-Fi and there's concerns about things going wrong. Same thing for charging portable devices, that if a student's battery dies during the test, they can plug it in and restart or continue the test where they left off. The only downside is they might lose time during that process. Depending on the administration center, they may or may not have some amount of charging capability. I would not trust that any of the centers do, or certainly not enough for every student to plug in their device while they're working. So this definitely means it's worthwhile to charge whatever device you're using beforehand to make sure that you've got enough to go through the test. The test is computerized, and this means students enter their answers on the computer and read out any prompts on the computer. Students are allowed scratch paper throughout the entire test, both the reading and writing and the math section. But there's also a number of tools provided on the computer application itself that hopefully make that process a little easier. A few things that they have. So we have a timer, so students can see the time that they have remaining in each section throughout the entire test. They can hide the timer if that's something that's perhaps stressing them out to look at. It provides a little warning when you're nearing the end to tell you that you've only got a few minutes left. There's a built-in graphing calculator. This is actually one from speaking to students that students are most interested in and find the most hopefully positive about the changes. Graphing calculators were already allowed on the old version of the SAT. However, many students struggle to use their graphing calculators effectively. The new graphing calculator that's provided is one that many students are familiar with, called Desmos. In general, it is just significantly easier to use than a lot of the handheld calculators. With that said, students are still more than welcome to bring a physical calculator if that's something that they are more comfortable doing. Perfectly allowed and definitely something that they can do. Students do get a reference sheet on the math section. It is the same reference sheet that was on the previous version of the test. It doesn't tend to be particularly applicable for many of the questions, but it does have a few key formulas that are useful. A couple other tools. There's a highlighting and annotation tool. This is kind of nice on the reading section to be able to take notes. I'll be perfectly frank, this is not quite as convenient as actually annotating a piece of paper in front of you. There's something significantly harder about having to type in notes to yourself and click and drag and highlight than just having a pen in your hand. But it does exist and is certainly worth taking advantage of. There's an elimination tool, so students can cross out answers while they work, which is a great tool because that is a fantastic approach to a lot of the questions on the test. As well as some other accessibility tools like zooming in and zooming out. Things like text readers are available, things like that as well. One of the last ones, I guess the one out of order here, is review. So one thing that exists now is an option to flag a question for review. This is simply review for themselves. When the student gets to the end of each module, there will be a screen showing them all of the different questions, which ones they answered, if they left any blank, and any that they flagged to go back to. Hopefully just making it more convenient to make sure students don't skip a question by mistake or intend to go re-look over a question at the end and not get an opportunity to do so. As far as the content on the new version of the test is fundamentally little has changed between it and the old version. The two core concepts that are being tested, reading and writing, or verbal skills, and math, are still the core two. The topics in math have primarily stayed the same, similarly so in the reading and writing. There are a couple minor differences that I'll note here. One of the most evident ones in looking at the structure of the test is on the old version of the test, students had to read roughly page-long passages and then answer multiple choice questions based off of those. The passages now are all significantly shorter, no more than a paragraph, maybe two in length, followed by just a single question each. What this means for students going through the test is it tends to be a little more fast-paced and a little less in-depth in terms of their reading. So it's testing a bit of their ability to quickly pick up on ideas in short, abbreviated passages, rather than going super in-depth and connecting ideas in something larger. There's also a bit more of a focus on some of the logic in reading. A lot of the passages are a little more focused on things like scientific topics and argumentation, which requires students to connect evidence and conclusions in ways that they didn't quite have as strict questions on the previous version. Continuing changes on the reading section, there's a few different new passage types that have been included. Previously, it was primarily excerpts from pieces of literature, as well as articles and essays. They broaden that now to include things like poetry, things like notes, so they're presented with somebody else's notes on a topic and ask a question about that, and like I said, some more scientific style writing. As for the math, there's definitely been less that's changed there than the reading and writing. One of the minor changes is there seems to be an increased emphasis on things like data and statistics. This is still not a major part of the test, but it tends to be one that we find students struggle with because it's not something that's covered very thoroughly in a lot of different typical high school math curricula. So pretty much everything that I've said up until here applies equally to the digital SAT coming next year and to the digital PSAT that occurred just recently. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about the subtle differences between them and what exactly the PSAT is and does. So the PSAT is a practice SAT that is offered typically to sophomores and juniors every fall. It is very, very similar to the full SAT. In this new digital format, the format of the test, as in number of questions, timing, everything like that, is exactly the same as the full version of the SAT. There are minor differences in the content covered. There's one or two math topics that have been removed for the PSAT. And while it's harder to categorize, there are a couple different things that seem less prevalent on the reading section than the SAT, notably some of the things like logic questions. Yeah, for sophomores, this is basically just a good opportunity to be exposed to what's coming up next for them. The PSAT, which we'll talk about in a moment, is connected to the National Merit Scholarship Awards, but this does not apply to sophomores. For them, it's just exposure to the test. For many sophomores, there are a number of topics that they may have yet to see, specifically on the math section, depending on what math course they're currently taking. But it's still a useful gauge to see where they're currently at. For juniors, it is a fair bit more important. It's really their first opportunity to see what the SAT is going to be like, to practice it really under conditions that are going to be the same as the test itself. I can't tell you how many students I work with that feel super confident on the content. They're in advanced level math courses, but still struggle with the math portions of the test simply because of the format, the presentation, even things coming down to the physical setting of where they're taking the test can induce different states for this. So it's a great way for them to see where they're currently at in preparation for the SAT that they'll be taking later in the year. Additionally, we'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, one thing that is thankfully changed a bit this year is the release for scores for the PSAT. So the scores come in two batches this year on November 6th and November 16th, based on which day students took the test. It hasn't been confirmed by the College Board, but my belief is anybody who took it this previous Wednesday, this previous Saturday, is likely to receive their scores on November 6th. And those who took it later, or perhaps got accommodations that required them to take it at a different location or anything like that, will likely be at a later date. But about scoring, so one of the few things that is different about the PSAT than the SAT is the scoring. I mentioned earlier that the SAT is 2 scores out of 800, adding up to a cumulative out of 1600. For the PSAT, the 2 scores are out of 760, which are combined to a total score of 1520. It's a little strange why the College Board chooses to do it this way. The language that I've heard from them on this is to account for the fact that there are some subtle content differences between the PSAT and the SAT, with the idea being that if there's a math topic that only shows up on the SAT, that's what's accounting for those remaining 40 or 80 points on the overall score. Regardless, the PSAT is a very good indicator for students' ultimate performance on the SAT. The two tests are very similar, and the scaling of them is also very similar. A bit about the scoring on this. I mentioned this for the SAT, but it goes for the PSAT as well. The scoring simply works by taking their raw score, which is the number of questions they got correct and incorrect, along with whether they got the adaptive harder version of the second module or the easier version of the second module, and then use a formula from there to calculate a scaled score out of that. One minor note on scaled scores that does come up both on the PSAT and on the SAT itself is the scales vary slightly from test to test. This is based on the measured difficulty of those tests. This doesn't really mean anything for students' preparation, but it's so that students are aware that if they get the same number of questions wrong on one test versus another, they may very well end up with a slightly different scaled score at the end of the day. This is a preview of what the PSAT score results look like. Really, there's 3 big important numbers here, which is the reading and writing score, as well as the math score, as well as the cumulative score at the top. The College Board provides a little bit of extra info for contextualizing some of this. So things like the student percentile. Some versions of this report will also report both national percentile and things like more local statewide percentile. It also gives you a vague sense of what they've got on the bottom here. The check marks are what they consider sort of college preparedness, of whether you have demonstrated the expected level of knowledge in the respective domains for each of those. I briefly mentioned this before, but I'll go into a little more here, that the PSAT, specifically for juniors, is also a test that allows them to be included in the National Merit Scholarship Awards. The National Merit Scholarship, I believe it's company, has their selection index, which is basically a calculation based on student performance on the PSAT. They go through some interesting math to calculate what they call their selection index, but it's at the end of the day just based on student performance and how many questions they get wrong and right on the exam. From there, they designate a group of students who are particularly high performing to receive recognition in the National Merit Scholarship Program. This is something that students could, for example, put on an application or a resume. It is also broken down to some extent by state. So the cutoff for whether a student gets accepted into this is not known entirely in advance. It is somewhat dependent on other student performance. But typically you have to be quite high scoring to achieve this, but that is one of the other things that that the PSAT is for. Last note on this, I don't believe this is a problem for most students, but in order to finalize their eligibility, students do need to eventually then still take the SAT to come here. In the PSAT report that students get, they will also get their National Merit Scholarship Index, as well as a little bit of more information as to future planning and course recommendations, other scholarship opportunities that the College Board associates with there. And then the last thing is that students can also receive a bit more granular information about their performance on a test. This is both for the PSAT and the SAT. What level of granularity actually depends on exactly which test the student took. Only certain tests are released in full. The College Board doesn't publicly make available all of their previous tests. Which means that depending on the test, they can either get at least this information, which breaks questions down by which specific questions they missed, what topics they were missing most frequently, the level of difficulty of the questions they were missing. And on some particular administrations of the test, they can also actually see the questions themselves and review it as well. Awesome. All right. I think that mostly covers all of our new digital things.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, and that was great. Again, Andrew started today kind of with an overview of really the changes to the PSAT and SAT, as I know that was on the minds of many of you. And again, with your students taking the PSAT just this last week, now is a great time to begin to think about the next steps in this process. So I'm going to take over from here, and I want to start by talking a little bit about the SAT versus the ACT. We already talked in detail about the SAT. Again, it's broken up into, 4 different modules. The first 2 are the reading and writing, each is 32 minutes each. 25 operational questions, which basically means 25 questions that will count in each module, and 2 pre-test questions. The pre-test meaning these are used for research and potentially can be used on future exams. Those 2 questions that are used for research are not going to count towards the score. The challenge, unfortunately, for most students or for all students is they don't know which tests or which questions will not count, which ones will. So they obviously need to attack all 27 reading questions and writing questions in each module with the intent of getting everyone right. As Andrew mentioned, the passages are much smaller. I would say that's really the fundamental biggest difference in addition to the adaptive and digital nature of the test. The passages in the previous SAT or the SAT that will be happening through December are still, page-long passages, typically accompanied by 9 to 12 questions. The new SAT digital format will have much smaller passages, 25 to 150 words, with a single multiple choice question at the end. They will contain some graphs and tables, and again, 1 question per passage. The math is really unchanged, again, other than the digital nature. Still 35 minutes each. 20 operational questions, 2 pretest questions, 22 questions total in those 35 minutes. 3/4 of the questions in each math section will be multiple choice. And just like it already is, 1/4 of the questions will be free response, meaning students will literally bubble in, or in this case, now type in the value of the answer choice that they found. A calculator, another subtle change, but I think important for many students. The current SAT format that will be happening through December, the pencil and paper test, a calculator is not allowed on one of the math sections. So only one of the 2 math sections allows for a calculator. The new digital format allows for calculator on both math sections. And just like the current SAT, the new digital SAT, the math questions are in order of difficulty. The reading and writing questions are not, but the math questions are. So just a little insight, that is important when we're coaching students on how to approach the test. One of the things that we're very focused on is making sure that we're being very accurate and detail oriented early and often, knowing that the easier and medium questions are going to be vitally important to getting right in order to give ourselves a little bit of room for error in case we get to some very difficult questions towards the back end of each math module. Again, 2 reading and writing modules. Everybody takes the first one, and depending on how they do, they'll either take a more challenging reading and writing module or a less challenging reading and writing module. Then there is a 10-minute break. Then the 2 math modules, same thing as before. Everybody takes this first math module, and then depending on how they do in that first one, they'll either take a harder or less difficult for the second. The ACT. The ACT is still very popular. Historically speaking, the ACT has always been somewhat of a Midwest test. If you grew up in the Midwest, chances are you actually took the ACT and not the SAT growing up. Vice versa, if you're like me and grew up on the West Coast or East Coast, you probably took the SAT because that's just what everybody did. Over the last 20 years or so, with students continuing to apply across the country and students becoming more and more focused on selective schools, and giving them more and more chances to really strengthen their admissions profile, you see a lot of students, potentially taking both or taking some diagnostic tests, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, to focus on, one or the other, depending on which one is going to be their better score. The ACT has 4 sections. They're always in this order: English, math, reading, and science. There is an optional writing essay. The essay is not part of the overall score. It is a side score. So the English section is very much grammar, sentence structure, punctuation, etc. Math, pretty self-explanatory, very similar to the math on the SAT. I would say the subtle difference between the math on the SAT and the math on the ACT. The math on the SAT has a bit more of a bent toward Algebra 2 and a slight de-emphasis of geometry. While the ACT has historically been a little bit more of a bent towards geometry and a little bit less of an emphasis on Algebra 2. But again, when we're coaching students, really the techniques, the approaches, the overall mindset of going into that math section really doesn't matter between SAT versus ACT. The reading section is going to be a little bit different now. Again, the new digital SAT will have those paragraphs. The reading on the ACT is still in the traditional format of a passage and 10 questions. So there are 4 unique passages, 10 questions each. And then you have the science section. One thing that you hear a lot from students, they hear science and they immediately say the ACT is not for me, I don't like science. One of the things that we really communicate very early on, and I will share with you now as well, you do not have to be, incredibly great at science to do very, very well in the science section. In fact, honestly, you could have never taken a science class in your entire life and get a perfect score in the science section. So the science is not really testing your background knowledge or content in any specific science area. It is very much focusing on testing students' ability to interpret random charts, tables, and graphs effectively. Students are given a chart to go along with maybe some random experiments, and their job is to extrapolate the correct information from that data. Again, they don't have to have a strong background knowledge in science. And again, the essay is optional. You're seeing fewer and fewer students take that. But again, if your student is a strong writer and wants to really showcase those strengths, the writing is a great way to do that. One quick thing I wanted to also highlight, the scores for each of these. Each English, math, reading, and science section is out of 36. So a 36 is a perfect score on each individual section. And the ACT composite score is not the sum of your scores, but an average of the 4 scores. So if you got 2 32s and 2 30s, that would average out to a 31. Your composite would be a 31. 30 or 30.25, for example, those zeros or 0.25s, they round down. So a 30.25 would round down to a 30 overall. 0.5s and 0.75s are great because they round up. So a 30.5 or a 30.75 would round up to a 31. When you're talking about SAT versus ACT, it's one thing it's important to really keep in mind that there is a lot of overlapping content between the two. In fact, probably about 3/4 of the test are pretty much very similar to each other. When I'm talking about the ACT, for example, I'm always highlighting the English and the math are very similar to what you're going to see on the SAT. I would say the reading and the science on the ACT are going to be a little bit different. Reading and science are, one of the things that we're going to, I want to highlight about the ACT. It's a very fast-paced test. Students, if you put the SAT content down in front of a student and the ACT content down in front of a student and ask them to work through it untimed and ask them what they preferred or liked better, probably the majority would actually prefer the ACT content. It tends to be a little bit more straightforward. It's a little less deceiving. They're not trying to trick you nearly as much. And it's just, I always try to say it's a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more accessible. The challenge, of course, with the ACT is it isn't untimed. It's a very fast-paced section, particularly in that reading and science sections. For example, I talked about the reading a little bit earlier. There are 4 passages of 10 questions each. You only have 35 minutes total to read those 4 passages and complete those 40 questions. So you have a little less than 9 minutes per passage and 10 questions to finish. So one of the things that we're coaching our students on, of course, is using their time very effectively and very efficiently. It's tricky for students who really kind of get, unfortunately, bogged down in certain questions. Sometimes we're really coaching our students that we don't want to let one question affect our ability to get to 3 or 4 more at the end, especially considering that, like the SAT, the ACT, the only section that is in order of difficulty is the math. So if you're running out of time on the reading or running out of time on the science and you have to randomly guess for the last 5 questions, then that's not ideal because those could be the 5 easiest questions on that section theoretically. So it's important when we're working with students that we're really focusing a lot on the appropriate pacing when it comes to the ACT. Again, which type of student is better fit for the SAT or ACT? In general, and I'm going to generalize here, students who are natural test takers, students who may be stronger in math than other subjects, or students who like to work more methodically, who do not like to be rushed, the SAT is often a better fit. I really emphasize the math here. Simply put, math makes up half of the scores on the SAT. Math only makes up 1/4 of the scores on the ACT. So when I'm talking with parents daily about, the right fit for their student, one of the things I'm trying to look or find out is math a strength of theirs or not? If it is, they might want to lean towards that SAT because that's already half of the test that they feel very strongly or comfortable with. If it's not, they might want to lean towards the ACT because, again, obviously we want them to do well in the math section, but it would be great to have that factor or diffused amongst 3 other sections in that sense as well. Vice versa, students who are not natural test takers, students who are not traditionally phenomenal standardized test takers, may prefer and like the ACT more, as I mentioned, because of the more straightforward nature in that test. Again, if they're a little bit weaker in math compared to other subjects, or they're very quick workers. If your student is the first one done with many tests, the ACT might be a better fit early on. All that said, we strongly encourage students to take some diagnostics early in the process. We actually hold these diagnostics and practice tests free of charge every weekend, both in person and online, for our current and prospective students. So obviously your student probably just took the PSAT last week. We might, now might be a great time to begin or think about taking an ACT diagnostic in the coming weeks. So when we get that PSAT score back in early to mid-November, we have that data point to compare with maybe an ACT and be able to use these scores to determine what might be the better fit. Again, if your student is highly competitive, and honestly, if you're taking the SAT or ACT, you probably fit that category because more of the highly competitive students are focusing on those exams right now. You may be a good fit to take both. Again, I mentioned the overlapping content between the two. If you're preparing for one, for the most part, you are preparing for the other. So there's a lot of opportunities to prepare for a first test, take that first test, and then hybrid over for a few additional sessions to focus on the other test, specifically emphasizing or focusing on the major differences between the two tests. One thing that I want to highlight right now that many parents ask is, do certain schools take or not take the SAT versus the ACT? And the answer is no. If a school is test optional or it requires a test, they don't care if it's the SAT or the ACT. So when we're working with students to determine the better fit for them, we're not really worried about what schools they're applying to per se, in the sense that we are focused much more on what's going to be the better score. There is a way to compare these SAT to ACT scores in an apple-to-apples comparison. So we're focused almost exclusively on what is going to be the better score and what's going to strengthen your application. Last but not least, for you students who maybe have extended timing testing accommodations, students who have learning differences and are able to receive extra time, it's almost inevitable that the ACT is going to be the better fit. If you're a parent and you came to me and said, Pat, I've got a student, they have extended time for both the SAT and the ACT, I will almost universally direct you towards the ACT because, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest challenge for the ACT for most students is how fast they have to work, the quick pace that is needed to be able to get to all the questions. By having testing accommodations, by having extra time, we're really eliminating that challenge for the most part. Want to talk a little bit about the upcoming testing landscape. So as far as the current SAT goes, the SAT, the pencil and paper test, is going to be offered 2 more times. It's going to be offered in the first Saturday of November and offered again in the first Saturday of December. For the class of 2024, these seniors, this might be their last opportunity to take it. So we're seeing a lot of seniors try to take it for the last time. We also have a good number of juniors who maybe did some preparation over the summer or early fall and want to give themselves an opportunity to take the SAT in the pencil and paper format before it goes away. And then once December happens, that pencil and paper test is gone. It will not come back. And starting in March, for March, May, and June of the spring, it will be exclusively the digital SAT. All right. So again, we've got a little bit of carryover for the class of 2025. For the class of 2026, you sophomore parents, we are thinking exclusively about the digital test for your students. I saw a question in there earlier. Should my sophomore maybe be thinking about taking the November or December SAT before the pencil and paper test goes away? Honestly, without knowing your student and the proficiency of them and within the test, I would generally say no. Most students don't take these exams until their junior year, and for good reason, because students are maturing in the process. They still are learning more content in school. And while a student may do well in November of their sophomore year, they're much more likely to do even better in the fall of junior year, and then the spring of junior year, and then subsequently, of course, maximizing their scores in potentially the summer and fall of senior year. The ACT is not changing its format as of now. Again, it's still a pencil and paper test. We've got an October test coming up. We've got a December test coming up, then a February test, an April test, and a June test. Again, the June test is very popular for some students because it's typically a week or two out of school. We're also thinking about APs during this time. So one of the things that factors into, determining what might be a better fit for a student in terms of their timeline. Keep in mind, late April, early May is very busy with AP preparation and testing. And then obviously you've got, finals, in mid to late May, early June as well. One of the big things that it's important to talk about today is how do the SATs and ATs fit into the current college admissions process? So a lot has changed in the last 4 years. So many schools have now gone what's called test optional. So again, before the pandemic, in 2019, there were about 1,000 colleges that were test optional. Now, in this most recent application cycle, that's almost double. All right. So again, there's been a big push towards more test optional skills, giving students options to decide whether to turn in their scores or not. And so, hopefully that's taken a little bit of the stress off of students in some way, knowing that, hey, you can always prepare for these exams, and worst case scenario, you don't have to turn these scores in. But we'll talk a little bit about why we feel it's important to be seriously considering and planning on taking these exams, particularly if you're applying to some of the more selective schools. Some quick data here. More than 1.7 million high school students took the SAT in 2022. ACT was a little bit lower than that, about 1.3 million students. Here are some data for the class of 2026 accepted students. So this is about a year ago for students who took and submitted their SAT scores of those who were accepted. Now, keep in mind, this includes students who turned in both the SAT and ACT scores. So I can't say, by definition that Yale, for example, with 59% submitted SAT, 29% ACT, I wish I could say, hey, 88% of the students turned in SAT or ACT scores. There's certainly some overlap. There's going to be some students that turned in potentially both. But you can see these numbers are pretty big. I mean, Notre Dame, for example, that adds up to 100%. Now, again, it's obviously not 100%, but, it's a strong majority in a lot of these more selective schools. You look at Stanford, you look at Northwestern, you look at Harvard, there are still more than half of the students for sure who are accepted who are turning in these scores. So what we are encouraging students to do is really plan on taking these tests and really trying to showcase as strong of a profile as they can. At the end of the day, if their scores aren't where they need to be, for certain schools that they're applying to, they can always potentially choose to not turn them in. But I think it's important to understand and recognize that if you're not turning in a score to a school, the school simply is going to assume that those scores weren't very good. That's not to say that they're not going to get in, but that is the assumption that many schools are making. Now, I did want to include quickly, there are already still schools that require SAT and ACT tests. Schools like MIT, Georgetown, Georgia Tech, Purdue, etc., are a few of the schools that still require those. And we are starting to slowly see a pendulum shift. For the class of 2025, we may see more schools potentially be added to the requirement of these SAT and ACT tests. And then certainly the class of 2026 when it comes to the high school class. So there is starting to see a little bit of a return towards requiring these tests at many schools. But again, the majority of schools that your student applying to will still be test optional moving forward. Some more information here. Again, this is the class of 2025, selective colleges with high test submission rates. You can see here, for example, Johns Hopkins, roughly 6% admin rate, but about 81% of students turned in those scores. So you see Princeton on this list, Yale on this list, Duke on this list, Harvard on this list, Michigan, UT, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, etc. Again, these are just examples of while being test optional, it's still very important for students to be strong considering taking these tests. So talking a little bit about what we can be doing as AJ Tutoring to help students prepare for the SAT and ACT. So we already talked a little bit already about beginning possibly with some free diagnostic testing. Again, your students generally took the PSAT probably in the last week or so. So maybe there's an opportunity to take the ACT in the coming weeks and have both points of data to be able to compare and contrast to moving ahead. As I mentioned already, we hold mock SAT and ACT exams every weekend for our current and prospective students free of charge. We hold these in our East Bay offices. We hold these in Menlo Park, in Palo Alto, in Saratoga, in San Jose. We hold them online. For our, if your student is interested in taking a full-length digital diagnostic SAT, we can send you the program that students can simply log on to, click, and it will guide them and proctor them at home under proctored conditions. In terms of a test preparation, we do hold and conduct a few group classes, but realistically, we're known for our one-on-one test preparation. And most students typically meet for about 10 hour-and-a-half sessions in preparation. Ideally, we're spacing those out probably around a 12 to 15-week period prior to the exam. We can always modify the number of sessions to best fit each student's needs, family budgets, etc. We do a lot of work with students who are retaking the exam. The good news about retakes, you don't need to do another 10 sessions. Typically, we've done the heavy lifting in that first wave of preparation with those approximately 15 hours of one-on-one instruction. We probably then would plan on 3 to 4 review sessions for any retake, placing a special emphasis on specific areas that students want to improve on, as well as taking some practice tests in the process as well. Last but not least, a lot of parents want to know kind of when to begin that preparation. Realistically, we always say the summer before junior year is really a great time to begin the process. But, if you didn't prepare over the summer before junior year, that's totally okay. There's plenty of time to complete those preparations. There's plenty of times to focus on those upcoming spring exams. So don't feel like you're late to the game if you didn't get started already. Wanted to highlight a few testing plans that can make sense. It really depends a lot on, the intensity with which your student is focused on, how important these scores are going to be for their application process, and just their interest for the most part. A minimalist approach would just really be taking it once, SAT or ACT in spring of junior year, doing your best. Maybe that's it. Maybe you're good. Keep in mind, most students take the SAT 2 to 3 times. I talk to parents daily, and I know there's always a great goal of taking it once and being done with it, but that doesn't always happen. And there's a number of different reasons why one would want to retake it. One of them being that scores continue to typically climb over time. So while a student may do very well in the SAT in March of junior year, they may even do even better in August or October of senior year, given another 6 months in school, another 6 months of maturity, things of that nature. A more common approach, or the most common approach, is typically taking one of these exams in the spring of junior year and then retaking it 1 to 2 more times, later in the spring, in the summer, or early fall. If you've got a recruited athlete or an early approach, those students will often want to take the test earlier. We do see a good number of juniors taking the SAT for the first time in August, or the ACT for the first time in September. One of the reasons why that is there's a very busy junior year for them. And the goal is to unburden them with some of the test preparation during the school year. So we always have a great goal of course, trying to, really help our students reach their goals earlier in the process. But at minimum, worst case scenario, if they don't reach their goals their first time around, at least they've done a lot of the heavy lifting during the summer and taken the burden off of a busier school year to retake those exams. But again, the early and recruited athlete approach, SAT in August or ACT in September, another retake in spring of junior year, and then another retake potentially in summer or fall of senior year. Last but not least, your intense approach is really focusing on both exams. We talked about a hybrid approach. There's a lot of overlap. That might include taking the test in March for the SAT, hybriding over for a few additional sessions for the April ACT, retaking both in June, and then potentially retaking both one more time in the fall of senior year. So you have potentially 6 tests to choose from in terms of turning scores in. Additional questions to things to know about SAT and ACT testing. First of all, what's a good score? That's a really difficult question to answer, to be honest, but it's a good question and I understand it. A good score, we always say, is the score that gets you into the school of your choice. Every school is going to be a little bit different. Obviously, what you've seen with a lot of the test optional schools is this movement with the scores increasing, meaning let's say, for example, the average score of a school before the pandemic was 1450. It now might be 1500, mainly because only the stronger scores are being turned in. So students who do not have to turn in lower scores because it's no longer required are obviously withholding those scores as part of their application. So the natural outcome of that is you're seeing the average scores climb, which unfortunately means that students are more intimidated to turn in what used to be really good scores. So what's a good score is really going to be determined by the school. And this is where we would encourage you to speak to your school counselors. If you work with independent counselors as well, they're great resources to identify what scores you may be looking for. And just a small plug here at AG Tutoring, we actually do a lot of college counseling now ourselves. So we can be a great resource for you and your students who may be looking for college counseling support, at some point. So let us know. Super scoring. We talked about retakes. Another reason why it's really optimal to take it 2 or 3 times is many schools will allow you to do what's called super scoring, which means that you can take individual section scores from different sittings and create and compile your overall super score. So if I got an 800 in math on one sitting, but a lower score in reading on that same sitting, I retook the SAT, got an 800 in reading, but a lower score in math, I can now take my 2 800s for certain schools and have a perfect score. So again, this leads to the opportunity and the benefit of taking the test 2 or 3 times to give you opportunities to also create a better super score. We already talked about when to begin preparing. Optimally, that would be the summer before junior year, but there is no time that's too late. We often have even seniors begin to prepare in the summer before senior year with the intention of taking the SAT in summer and fall of senior year, which can be totally fine as well. Talked about how many times students should take their test. That's typically 2 to 3 times. Lastly, do colleges see all the student scores? The answer is no. Schools are only going to see the scores that you personally send them. Now, there are going to be a handful of schools, Stanford, for example, is one of them, does ask students to send in all of their scores. They ask students to send in all of their scores. But again, students can choose to send in only the scores that they want student or the schools to see. Now, again, with the caveat, if you're talking about super scoring, for example, you have to send in your entire test that you want to be part of the super scoring. You can't pick and choose just to send an English section from one ACT and a math section from the other. You have to send in all of those scores that were part of that test, and then they will super score on their behalf for you. Last but not least, UCs. I'm a UC Davis graduate myself. I'm a UC fan. Go Aggies. We're lucky to be part of a state that has such a wonderful public college system. And many of your students may be interested in planning to go to UCs. Now, one thing to keep in mind about UCs, they are test blind. So if you do well or you don't do well in the SAT or ACT, that doesn't matter. There is no opportunity for you to turn in your SAT or ACT scores for those UCs. All right. Now, what does that mean? Should your student take the SAT or ACT at all? The answer is yes, mainly because there are very few students who are focusing exclusively on the UCs. And even if that might be their initial approach early on, they may end up adding schools later. Very rarely is a school list static at an early stage. It's ever evolving, ever growing. your student is maturing and growing in their tastes and preferences, and what they might want, end of sophomore year might change dramatically in the end of junior year. So it's important to be able to plan accordingly for all the schools that your students may be applying to, including test optional and even test required schools. In addition, these test taking skills that you learn for the SAT and ACT help on school tests. We're always telling our students, whether you like it or not, the SAT or ACT is probably not the last standardized test that you're going to take. We of course help students with their MCATs and LSATs and GREs and GMATs. So there's a lot of more standardized tests that we have students still to this day reaching out and saying, man, those test taking techniques that you helped with me 6 years ago really helped me dramatically on the LSAT or the MCAT, etc. Last but not least, as the SAT and ACT scores can exempt students from an entry level writing requirement. And that's about it in terms of wrapping up the presentation. Again, we thank you for being here. Again, this is my information, my email, really easy, pat@ajtutoring.com. You've got Andrew's number here in email as well. Of course, you can always email all of us at info@ajtutoring.com or at 650-331-3251. And we will be there to help answer any questions that you have. I'm going to stop.